drugs are a major problem in the Southwest, with drugs abuse hotspots like Bodmin being of particular concern. As with most police forces in Britain today, the police force here in the Southwest has pursued a policy of de facto decriminalization of drugs use, whereby you pursue the pusher but not the user. There are those that argue that it may be better all round to stop prosecuting the small-time pusher, the petty drugs dealer who is also a user, and concentrate our resources on the major criminals who are causing so much disruption to our society. If elected, I shall experiment with this policy in one carefully chosen targeted area. But the jury is out, as far as I am concerned, on the best way to deal with our severe drugs problem in the Southwest. What people find it hard to tolerate is disorderly behavior by drugs users, the drugs users they encounter in the street. This can range from aggressive begging to downright intimidation. Such behavior cannot and will not be tolerated, and we will crack down on it. Let me make it clear, however, that drugs is a health issue. Drugs abuse is in essence a public health issue. Those who are addicts, whether addicted to drugs or to alcohol, are ill and need our care, in which context we are all too aware of the biggest problem in our society, which comes from alcohol-related crime and alcohol-related antisocial behavior. And we must not let our understandable concern about drugs blind us to this key issue. If elected, I will use a substantial proportion of the charity sector budget available to the police commissioner to establish a state-of-the-art detox center for drugs and alcohol for under 21s here in the Southwest. And indeed, a plan will be put in place to see that this is done urgently. I will be honest with you, I regard all drugs use as disturbing, but I feel, rightly or wrongly, that heroin use is a particular concern in the Southwest, partly because of the aggressive behavior associated with heroin users when deprived of their fix. If elected, one of the first actions I will take will be to establish a drugs working group to examine the best strategies to deal with this problem. The discussion which follows is with Peter Dannheisser, a man who believes in the total decriminalization of drugs. I hope you'll find it thought-provoking. So Peter Dannheisser, my friend, you have strong views on drugs. I have strong views on drugs. You're an ex-BBC man, but and so not a particular drugs expert, but we come at this issue from different angles. For me, you talk of the need for the decriminalization of drugs rather than the legalization. So, and you explained to me earlier, that means that drugs users are not prosecuted, whereas the people who sell drugs might be, but depending on the circumstances. So that's what you advocate. I'm not convinced. We both agree, as I see it, that there is not enough care for the drug user. The addict. We both agree that this country is shameful in so much as it doesn't have detox centers for under 21s for drugs and alcohol. We both perhaps agree that, I think we both agree that any addiction, when it gets out of hand, whether it's alcohol addiction or drug addiction, when it gets out of hand, is not to be encouraged. But so why do you think that we should decriminalize drug use?
I think the problem of making it a legal offence is that it changes society's view of the issues. The issues really are not of great harm to society. The drug addict is obviously harming him or herself hugely, the family hugely. The unforeseen consequences of robberies and burglaries and all the rest of it are clearly something that must be avoided because of the sheer damage to society, but that's not the direct damage that the drugs cause. Drug taking in this country is not a huge problem, not nearly as far-ranging as the problems of alcohol, for example, but it is a problem, and therefore I would like to speak positively and not negatively about it. I would like to speak positively of the medical approach to drug taking. Most drug addicts want to come off their drugs.
Yeah, but if you decriminalise drugs, then you're encouraging it. I mean, socially, you're encouraging more drug use, surely.
That's not the evidence, and there have been a few experiments around the world, as in particular Portugal, but also a couple of states in America, Colorado, Washington, mainly to do with lighter drugs, cannabis and so on. The figures for drug taking in this country anyway are going down hugely, but that's mainly for not for the Class A drugs. The Class A drugs, the serious drugs, have remained very stable, and mostly for young people, and most of those young people actually come off their drug addiction in time. By the time they're 24, 25, 26, most of them are off.
But there are a lot of problems with the, younger addicts, who are, whether it's drugs or alcohol. Yeah. But there are serious problems with young people who get.
I couldn't agree more. But then giving them a criminal record, banging them up in homes or remand homes or whatever, is not really going to help unless they have huge amount of help within those organisations. And even so, they will leave with criminal records, with a blot that is very hard to live with. They will find getting jobs harder, and so on and so on. So we know all that result. The real problem for society is the number of people in prison at the moment who are there because they've had to raise money to pay the dealers. The dealers aren't in prison, not the big dealers. They're having a great old time. The warlords abroad are not having a problem. It's the small man who's put in prison because he had to steal something and sell it for a quarter of its price or a tenth of its price in the local pub. He's in prison.
I can see an argument for, I'm not sure I'm convinced, but I can see an argument for the decriminalisation of cannabis use, and in practice we have decriminalised cannabis use.
Yes.
It may not be technically it's a crime, but in practice in this country, I
agree.
I think there are problems with long-term cannabis use, but we have de facto decriminalised it. The question then comes when you talk about harder drugs. I mean, if you're going to go the same route with heroin, I know in the Southwest we've got this end of the line syndrome. We get right down the end of the Southwest in Penzance is the highest rate, or was certainly the highest rate per capita of registered heroin users in Britain. Per capita, I mean, I'm not saying a big city might have many more. So the situation is, and that is a recreational drug that does make people aggressive when they don't get it. It's one of those drugs that people get very tense and very aggressive in its absence. Unlike alcohol, you get aggressive when you take it. Surely, to talk about decriminalising something like heroin is very dangerous.
It depends on your view. There aren't many addicts, and I believe they must be helped. And you're not going to help them by turning them into criminals. That's just a view I have. I don't think the numbers will go shooting up, but can I ask you, if there is some doubt, and there are many people, not just me, who feels there is some doubt, then would it not be possible to run an experiment? Maybe for 5, 10 years. I mean, it couldn't be overnight and it couldn't be for a week or two, but it would have to be for a reasonable amount of time, just as Colorado and Washington have done experiments, and Portugal very successfully for over a dozen years now has had a successful experiment with cannabis. Why not run an experiment? But use the money that would otherwise be spent on legal procedures, on putting people in prison. It costs, what, £40,000 a year to put somebody in prison. In prison, we know they become addicts even if they didn't start as addicts.
Yes,
I don't know how that happens. Now with drones, I think it's probably easier to get drugs into prison, but
it is shameful.
It's a shameful story.
Yeah.
I'm not taking a moral stand on this. I'm just saying it ain't working, so let's try and fix it, and let's do it experimentally in this country by a local authority maybe. I don't know how you'd feel about it in the southwest.
The local authority couldn't do it. It would have to be a police commissioner.
A regional way.
In our elected system, you could arguably, I don't know whether you should, arguably, the only person with the power to suggest to a chief constable that they should take such a radical step and decriminalise the use of hard drugs would be a elected police commissioner. There's nobody else that could make that suggestion.
And that person would work very closely with the medical authorities, presumably, would have the clinics.
The only person that could do this kind of thing would be a elected police commissioner. No elected police commissioner has tried this. I'm very dubious about the whole idea, but it's certainly an interesting subject. I think it's one that's troubled me from the beginning. When I stood a few years ago, when they first started this whole question of police commissioners, I was most troubled by the absence of a detox centre for under 21s in Britain. I mean, it is a crime, actually. I talk about a crime, that's a crime. It's truly offensive that we don't have that. And it was one of the commitments that I wanted, was to see a detox centre for under 21, specifically for drugs and alcohol, because but I've always been troubled by drugs policy. You haven't convinced me, but the one thing you have convinced me is that it really needs a lot more thought, and I would have to give it a lot more thought between now and the election. After the election, if I were elected, it's what we're doing at the present clearly isn't working. Whether your solution is the right one, I'm not sure, but we really need a lot of public debate about the issue in order to move things forward, to move policy forward.
Would there be any sense in running it as an experiment? In other words, no commitment, an open mind, huge cooperation, not only with the medical authorities, but of course the system would have to have access to drugs. Those drugs could be bought from growers who grow the drugs for, or produce the drugs for medical purposes.
Yeah, but now you're talking
cutting out the middleman.
But that we couldn't do, could we? I mean, you can't regionally. If you're talking, as in our specific example, the Southwest.
Yes, I understand.
You're not talking about, and you would have to decide that the police force was not going to pursue drug users.
Absolutely.
Making that decision, you can't then control, because it's a national issue, you can't then control and have some mechanism to provide non-criminally sourced drugs. It's not going to work. So
I don't see why that's true. If you did that regionally, if the only place they could get drugs would be in highly controlled clinics,
but that's
the only place that they could take those drugs for medical reasons is in highly
But
controlled
again, you're
clinics.
going beyond the powers of the police. Only
Well,
power that
absolutely.
the police commissioner would have, and this is the number of it, or at least it would have to be in cooperation with the chief constable. The only power that they might have is to say, okay, we're going to de facto decriminalize other drugs in the same way as we have de facto decriminalized the use of
Indeed.
cannabis.
And it would be de facto decriminalizing on condition that the person found using drugs went through the clinics.
Interesting. Peter, thank you. That's very, very helpful. It's a real challenging discussion. Thank you very much.
Nothing's easy.
Okay.
Thank you.